Greetings, welcome to the show. This is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today I'm going to touch on the United Nations and the World Economic Forum and this partnership that was signed in 2019. So there are concerns about what this partnership will mean for the running and the structure of the United Nations. And we know what the United Nations is, but in terms of the World Economic Forum, many people may have heard the name, but they don't know what that organization actually is. So I'm going to take a look at the history of the World Economic Forum and this partnership that it has with the United Nations. Although it may seem like a recent initiative, it actually goes back to the early 90s. So, in terms of the World Economic Forum, in terms of its beginnings, it began as far back as 1971. According to the WF website, it was founded in 1971 as the European Management Forum in January of that year. So the first symposium was held in Davos, well, it's still held in Davos nowadays, in 1987. It was renamed the World Economic Forum. And from there it became an annual meeting. They used to meet intermittently before, but then it became an annual meeting from 1987, from when it became the World Economic Forum. And the chairman and founder of this organization, or NGO, some would like to call it, is Professor Klaus Schwab. He's an engineer, economist, and he founded the forum in 1971 under the supervision of the Swiss government, the Swiss federal government. And he wanted to promote this concept that he had, this stakeholder capitalism. And he chose Davos as the starting place for his meetings. So this idea of this Charles Schwab, this stakeholder theory, is basically conceptualized in a book he had written, meaning that a company should serve its stakeholders, not just the shareholders, but also the employees, suppliers, and the community for which it is based. So this is the idea of a so-called socially responsible corporation, still based on the capitalist idea of the corporation owning and running much of the happenings in the world through commodities and so forth. So, a basic look at the structure of the World Economic Forum. So according to this document from its website, it's financed by fees from its 1,000 business members, most of them global companies with over $5 billion in annual turnover. It has approximately 800 employees located in Geneva and in regional offices in Beijing, New York, San Francisco, and Tokyo. So it has been described as a private NGO, a think tank, and a prominent private international organization. So in 2015, it was formally recognized as an international organization, enjoying the NGO status. So in terms of the this strategic partnership idea, it actually began in the 90s. And there was a discussion between the then executive director of the United Nations, or the Secretary General, I should say, of the United Nations, where he met Klaus Schwab in 1999 in Davos. And they discussed the idea. And it was basically about how to rally participants in support of a global effort to highlight the social responsibility of business, of the corporate sector, basically. This was the beginning of the UN Global Compact, although the document wasn't signed by then, but the idea began to be initiated from that period. So a set of 10 ethical principles that almost 10,000 companies have signed up to. Since then, the signing was actually in 2019. So let's look at the beginnings and of the WF, and also the partnership agreement that was signed between the WF and the United Nations. In terms of areas of interest, I'll be touching that in a minute. But according to another document, in terms of the general ideas around the WEF, so this is basically saying here that on his first visit, that is the head of the United Nations, I told you of my hopes for a creative partnership between the United Nations and the private sector. I made the point that in everyday work of the United Nations, whether in peacekeeping, setting technical standards, protecting intellectual property, or providing so much needed assistance to developing countries, helps to expand opportunities for business around the world. Basically saying that corporations should be more involved in the social aspects of society around the world. Which sounds good or benevolent, but you know, when corporations are involved in things don't necessarily turn out the way that people expect or people want. You know that corporations have their own interests in when they ever get involved in any type of project, and their main interests circulate around finance and money and profits. So there are 6 areas that are identified by the partnership, and these are financing the 2030 agenda, climate change, health, digital cooperation, gender equality, and empowerment of women, and then finally education and skills. So these are the main areas that they look at in terms of their idea of a so-called partnership to better the world. So in terms of the climate agenda, or the climate idea, there's an argument that this is mainly a false narrative created to stem or suppress the growth of economies in the global south. This idea that carbon dioxide is causing damage to the environment, and the fact that industrialization creates a lot of carbon dioxide. So the best way to suppress, one of the tactics that can be used to suppress the economic growth of the global south, is to claim that if they start industrializing the same way the Western countries have industrialized, then they'll produce too much carbon dioxide to the extent that it can damage the atmosphere, or will damage the atmosphere. So they've come up with these schemes like this carbon tax and whatever, and this idea that carbon dioxide is a danger to the environment. So anyway, let me continue here. This is the beginning of that idea of the climate change agenda. In April 1968, a 2-day meeting convened 30 European scientists, economists, and industrialists to Rome to steer the direction of global issues. This meeting essentially kick-started the Club of Rome, with the organization getting its name from the famous Italian city. Such issues included overpopulation, environmental destruction, urban pollution, and social discontent. So this is the formation of the Club of Rome and the narratives around climate change. And even the word sustainable that we find in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals that they aim to achieve by 2030 in terms of so-called making the world a better place. The word sustainable was hijacked decades ago, and it is now deceptively used to advance the agendas of globalist, mega corporate communist interests under the clever guise of fixing the problems of the world. In reality, these folks couldn't care less about the environment. The aim is to catapult humanity into the arms of the UN Agenda 2030 and other deceptive marketing plans entirely aligned with the objectives of the so-called elites of the WF, Davos group. So it's implying here that the aims of the United Nations has been directed basically by the World Economic Forum and its own corporate program. And the ultimate aim with this new so-called technocratic world where AI and computers and robotics are becoming dominant factors. In fact, just yesterday, there has been talk even by Bill Gates about within the next 10 years, the need of teachers will decline to the extent that, basically saying there'll be no more teachers. And this is an article, I think it's also on the WF website. All will be controlled: our money spending, health, data, food and eating habits, travels, TV viewer preferences, radio favorites, friends with whom we regularly meet and communicate, as well as others from the opposite camp, shopping, spending habits and so on. All will be controlled digitally by the IT digital corporate control system. The system where they're bringing in, for example, digital currencies, so people will no longer be using cash. So they'll be able to control how you spend your money and the fact that you can even spend money at all, since you won't have any cash. I don't think this will affect the global south so much. This is more something that will affect the Western countries, even though people are pushing back against these ideas. And in terms of the World Economic Forum itself, there have been some critiques about its, the aim of this partnership. And one of these critiques comes from, anyway, there's a letter written by a number of scientists who are concerned about the history or the direction that the WEF is taking the United Nations and taking the world in general. So the document is written by the Transnational Institute. Is a political research organization based in the Netherlands, and they wrote an open letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations. And this is just one of the short paragraphs from the letter. We are very concerned that this WF-UN partnership agreement will delegitimize the United Nations and provide transnational corporations preferential and differential access to the UN system. The UN system is already under a big threat from the US government and those who question a democratic, multilateral world. However, this corporatization of the UN poses a much deeper long-term threat, as it will reduce public support for the UN system in the south and in the north. Basically, people no longer trust the UN system if they see that it has been directed by corporations and big money, which, if you look at it, is quite true. And there's also another article here basically saying the same thing, how the United Nations is quietly being turned into a public-private partnership. So a new agreement with the World Economic Forum gives multinational corporations influence over matters of global governance. So these are the concerns of some people regarding the running of the United Nations, which is true. It's supposed to be an organization where heads of governments come together and discuss policies in terms of global governance. But if corporations come in and start to influence the leadership of the United Nations, then almost as if they're usurping the role of governments. And if corporations, multinational corporations, which we know already do influence governments, and they can also take it to the United Nations level, then what direction is the world going in? Then also, if we look at other aspects in terms of interference of the World Economic Forum in global affairs. And this is regarding vaccines and Bill Gates. At the annual meeting in 2000, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization was born. Among the earliest supporters of Gavi was Microsoft founder Bill Gates, who has been a regular Davos participant since 1996. And by 2023, Gavi had reached over 1.1 billion children, preventing, well, they're claiming here, preventing more than 18 million deaths. So they've also been involved in so-called prevention of AIDS, TB, malaria, and the coalition of epidemic preparedness innovations. When you hear about them talk about epidemic preparations, it means that they're testing viruses out there, even causing virus outbreaks in certain regions of the world, like Congo, in their testing of their man-made viruses, which they claim are naturally occurring instances. And another issue, not so, this gender issue, women and gender issue, was also something that was brought about through the World Economic Forum. The forum launched its milestone study, Women's Empowerment, Measuring the Global Gender Gap. This landmark effort to access gender equality had led to the Global Gender Gap Report, which the forum introduced in 2006, and has become one of the most closely analyzed annual benchmarking exercises after the Global Competitiveness Report. So they've been touching on a number of areas, and these are just a couple in society which they have used to could almost say manipulate the minds of the citizens of the world. So the World Economic Forum basically is a European program. As I said, it started out as mainly a European group of stakeholders in all aspects of society. Then it broadened out into a global project. And now it has been influencing the United Nations programs, basically. So that's a basic look at this partnership and what the aims of the partnership are, on the areas of the partnership. I haven't touched on much on all of the areas. I've touched on a couple. And the beginnings of, for example, this gender issue, and the Gavi, the beginnings of Gavi, this Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations. So that is it for now.